Senator Sessions can't, Senator Johanns can't, Senator McConnell and Senator Reid, with all of their stature, cannot either. That bully pulpit is unique to the President of the United States, and we have yet to see that responsibility met.
I thank the Senator, former governor, for those comments, and I do believe that it's difficult for Congress to ask the American people to make sacrifice if the President really doesn't acknowledge clearly and articulately the deep crisis we're in and why those sacrifices have to be made. It's not that we want to, it's because we don't have the money. And we have to make some changes in what we do. And that's why a number of us are called on the Majority Leader Reid to not recess next week, and let's stay here and do something about the debt. I understand we may now be staying here next week, but I'm not at all sure that the plan is to deal with anything involving the greatest threat to our nation, which is our debt. Apparently they want to talk about other issues. That wasn't what drove the concern. It wasn't about a patent bill, much as I would like to see it pass. That wasn't what we were concerned about when we said we need to be in next week. It's about the fact that by the end of this month, maybe the 1st of August, we'll see a monumental bill of some kind produced by the Democratic majority here in the Senate, brought out here, and we're going to be asked to vote for it in a matter of hours, being told every minute that the country is about to sink into oblivion if we don't just sign it and vote for it, not knowing fully what's in it, not fully having studied it, and the American people not knowing what's in it. That is wrong policy. We object to that. I believe the regular order in this Senate should be conducted, that we ought to have a proposal brought forth and so it can be amended, so it can be analyzed, so it can be accounted for, how much taxes is going to be raised by the President. What taxes does he propose to raise? What does Senator Reid want to do? Let's see those numbers and let's debate them and let's have amendments. And that's why we need to be here next week, not to deal with a patent bill or some other legislation. That's why we called on it. And I'm prepared to work, and I think our colleagues are, but it needs to be on something significant. And this history of our Congress and the surging debt crisis that we face is so significant that we have to have a balanced budget constitutional amendment. We almost passed that before. We would have been so much better had we done so. Let's do it this time and change the course of our country. Nothing clears the mind so well as the absence of alternatives. And when senators and congressmen have no alternative but to live within their means, they'll figure out a way to do it. But if they can find an alternative, history tells us too often we will, and we'll act irresponsibly. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
Mr. President, may I inquire how much time remains in our
7 minutes and 25 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I was frankly shocked by the President of the United States' comments yesterday at his press conference telling Congress that it needed to get to work. Get to work. I guess the President forgot that his party controls the United States Senate, and Republicans, being in the minority, have no ability to place matters on the agenda or to force a vote on issues over the objection of Senator Reid, the majority leader, and the Democrats who control the Senate. I guess the thing that rankled me so much, Mr. President, is rather than hold a press conference and tell Senator Reid to get to work on the budget, the President should have picked up this telephone or invited Senator Reid to come to his office and say, Harry, we need to pass a budget. We need to take care of this debt crisis. We need to take care of this cliff that we're getting ready to fall off of August the 2nd that Secretary Geithner has warned us would have perhaps calamitous impact on markets and on the economy and on interest rates charged on our national debt, among other things. I guess the most galling thing, listening to the President make this kind of outrageous speech, engaging in blatant electioneering, campaigning sort of rhetoric, class warfare, is that this comes from a person who, since January 2011, has had 31 fundraisers, including one tonight in Philadelphia. I wonder if he's going to cancel his fundraiser in Philadelphia tonight to meet with Senator McConnell and Speaker Boehner to try to work on this threat that he was so emphatic about yesterday. I predict he won't cancel his fundraiser in Philadelphia tonight to get to work on something that only he can do, which is to negotiate a grand bargain with Republicans and Democrats that will solve this problem. Well, we know he had time on Monday to videotape an appeal to his donors who wanted to solicit donations from people so they might win a dinner with President Obama and the Vice President Barack Obama. He had time to do that. Yet it wasn't until Monday of this week that the President himself first took ownership of this issue after Majority Leader Cantor and Assistant Leader Kyle said, you know what, we really can't negotiate with the Vice President because they keep insisting on raising taxes, and we just are not going to go there. And so the President had his first meeting with Republican Leader McConnell and the Majority Leader to talk about this issue that he was flailing Congress about not doing its job just yesterday. Frankly, he should be embarrassed. But unfortunately, the threshold for embarrassment here in Washington seems to be much higher than the rest of the country. The President said that Republicans were blocking the deal on the debt limit because they had taken tax increases off the table. Well, that's right. We believe it's a terrible mistake. With unemployment at 9.1%, much higher in many regions of the country, to raise taxes on the very people who you're depending on to create jobs. What's his message to people who can't find a job because people aren't hiring? What's his message to people who are out of work and they can't pay their home mortgage and they lose their home? Well, it's higher taxes. Let's just raise taxes and everything will be just fine. Well, we don't have a taxing shortfall. The American people pay plenty of taxes already. What we have is a spending binge by the federal government. Tax revenue is roughly 18% of our gross domestic product, but spending is 25%. Hence the $1.5 trillion deficit this year and the $14.3 trillion debt so far, which threatens our nation's future. Well, it frankly rankles many of us to have the President engage in such blatant demagoguery and blame shifting when he himself is unwilling to take responsibility for his duties, which are to lead by example. We're ready to work with the President to try to solve the nation's problems. The House has passed a proposal. It's not perfect. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but there are plenty of other proposals out there that will fix the nation's fiscal problems, one of which is the President's own Fiscal Commission itself. He appointed it, a bipartisan Fiscal Commission that reported back in December entitled Moment of Truth, otherwise known as the Bowles-Simpson Commission, a bipartisan commission the President appointed himself. But he's ignored it. There's another one, the Domenici-Rivlin Commission, another committee, another bipartisan commission that made recommendations. The President has ignored it. Ignored it. Well, the President yesterday said, quote, "Call me naive, but my expectation is that leaders are going to lead." That's what the President himself had the gall to say yesterday to the American people when he himself has displayed an astounding lack of leadership. Like I said, we're ready to work with the President. I know Senator McConnell invited him to come over to Congress and explain how this increase in taxes was somehow going to create more jobs in America, how we were going to solve the problems with Medicare, which is going to run out of money in a little over a decade. And I hope the President takes him up on that invitation. You know, it's not a partisan issue, really. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said our national debt sends a message of weakness internationally. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said that the single greatest threat to our national security is our debt. If America goes broke, how are we going to pay for our national defense and security that not only Americans depend on, but so many countries around the world depend on America being strong to protect them from tyrants and dictators and terrorists? But if our economy goes bust, if interest rates go up to historic norms, we could spiral out of control our economy. But there's not going to be a bailout for the United States of America. Our economy is simply too big. The International Monetary Fund, the Europeans, others are not going to bail us out while we continue to spend recklessly about 43 cents out of every dollar in money borrowed from these young men and women here sitting in front of me. From every baby born in America today comes into this world with $46,000 in debt. It's irresponsible. It's wrong. The American people sent a message in November of 2010 that they're sick and tired of Washington operating business as usual. And we're not going to take it anymore, and the American people shouldn't take it anymore. I think we have an opportunity here. In Texas, we don't recognize problems. We recognize challenges and opportunities. We're a positive bunch of folks. This is a grand opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to come together to do the nation's business, to be serious, not to be reckless, not to give demagogic speeches like the President gave yesterday as part of his re-election campaign. Absolutely disgraceful. He should be ashamed. I respect the office of President of the United States, but I think the President has diminished that office and himself by giving the kind of campaign speeches that he gave yesterday. We do have a solution. The senator from Alabama, Senator Sessions, and others of us have sponsored a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. This would be a responsible way to deal with this problem. And I hope we will get a vote on that shortly. But in the meantime, there's no reason we can't solve this problem. All we need is the President to step up and give us a proposal. So far, he's laid back and criticized everybody else and said, "Where's your proposal? How come you haven't done your work?" Well, he hadn't done his work by proposing a responsible solution. We'll have a debate. We'll have amendments. We'll make constructive suggestions. We'll do it out in the light of day and not behind closed doors, which is where these negotiations are occurring now. Why does this need to be done in secret? Why, as Senator Sessions said, are we, the elected representatives of the American people, left with a fait accompli shortly before a deadline and said, you either pass this or the country's economy goes down the tubes? That's not what the American people expect of us. That's not what they deserve. Now, sure, there are going to be differences of opinion, but that's what this Senate is for, to work those out. We all understand that we're not going to get what we want 100% of the time, but we do deserve to have a fair and open process, transparent and visible to the American people. I get to offer suggestions. They either win or they lose. And then ultimately, the majority vote determines the outcome. We respect that as the process by which these differences are resolved. But we can't do our job when the President doesn't do his job and make a responsible proposal when Senator Reid will not bring a budget to the floor. It's been 2 years since the United States Senate has had a budget. No one in the United States of America or anywhere around the world can operate with that sort of recklessness and irresponsibility. Everybody has to have a budget. My family has a budget. Every business has a budget. Only by having a budget can you determine what are your priorities, what are the things you have to have or do, what are the things that you can put off to tomorrow, what are the things that maybe would be nice to have but you can't afford. Every family, every business has to go through that process, but not the United States Senate. And not apparently the President of the United States. The proposal he made, which is doubled the debt in 5 years, tripled it in 10 years, called for huge new tax increases. But yet when it came up for a vote, and only because Republicans forced a vote on that, it lost. It didn't get any support. I think it was 97-0. Not even our friends across the aisle could support the President's outrageous proposal back then. So why didn't he come back with a new one? Why didn't he stay at the table? Instead of going to Philadelphia tonight and raising money, why didn't he call Senator McConnell, Speaker Boehner, Minority Leader Pelosi, and Majority Leader Reid into his office and sit down and do his job? Just do his job. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Aycock.
The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I ask also, Mr. President, I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the records.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator is recognized.
On my way here, Mr. President, I had the great pleasure of running into the Redway family just a few minutes ago, visiting from the state of Connecticut. Jack Redway is a former public servant in the state, and he's here with his family, his wife Sue, and other members of the family. And when I told them I was on my way here to talk on the floor of the United States Senate, they asked me what the subject was. And when I told them that the Senate is debating the debt and the deficit and the budget, one of them said, "Same old, same old." We are here on the same old issues, but the American people have had enough. They've had enough of the tax breaks and the special giveaways and the sweetheart deals that go to the special interests and that have driven our deficit to sky-high, intolerable levels. We are now at a turning point and really at a precipice when we simply cannot afford these kinds of tax breaks and sweetheart deals any longer. And the people of Connecticut are saying enough is enough to the same old deals with these special interests. We ought to come together on a bipartisan basis. Not only do we have a right and opportunity, we have a responsibility and an obligation to say enough is enough and to eliminate these kinds of tax breaks that squander and waste scarce resources. The ethanol subsidies have been voted on by this body overwhelmingly by Republicans and Democrats, rejected. And the reason is quite simply that we can save $400 million each month, close to $2.5 billion by the end of this year if we eliminate these subsidies on ethanol. We shouldn't be divided on this issue going forward. We ought to be united on a bipartisan basis because these scarce resources are necessary to make sure that we do not burden our children and their children with this kind of debt going forward. The loophole that enables corporate jets to be depreciated at a faster and higher rate than commercial airplanes, again, adds to the debt and the deficit in hundreds of millions of dollars. If we are serious about debt reduction and addressing the deficit, we should eliminate that loophole. It is about making the tax code fair and effective. And over the last decade, the big 5 oil companies have taken home more than $1 trillion in profits while enjoying tens of billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. Those monies, whether you call them revenues or taxes or breaks, whatever the nomenclature, whatever the rhetoric, they are a loss to the taxpayers and the people of the United States of America without any reason, because these 5 oil companies are among the most profitable and lucrative in the history of the world. And they don't need that money. It is time to say enough is enough to the kinds of hidden subsidies that go to special interests. And there are others that we ought to scrutinize and eliminate in the name of fairness and effectiveness in our government, so that we can be serious about addressing our debt and our deficit. Budgets are about choices. Some choices are not easy. We face tough choices, but we ought to put to use the common sense of the American people to say enough is enough to the same old, hidden subsidies, tax breaks, special giveaways to special interests. Cutting Medicare benefits, or Medicaid, will not make us stronger. Firing teachers will not make us stronger. Forcing kids out of college will not make us stronger in Connecticut or across the country. None of these measures will make us stronger as a nation or fairer. Nor will rolling back our investments in innovation and research, which are vital to the high-tech jobs of the future, nor will cutting our investments in the essential means of transportation, high-speed rail, so important to Connecticut. None of these cuts will bring back jobs, which has to be our priority. Economic growth and job creation must be put first. And the way to do it is to eliminate the wasteful tax subsidies, the breaks for special interests. Eliminating them will make us stronger. It will make us fairer as a nation. And, Mr. President, I urge that we come together and put aside whatever the labels and the rhetoric and the nomenclature are that we call them, and do the right thing to make our nation stronger and fairer. Thank you, Mr. President. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Hold it.
Withdraw my, Mr. President,
The senator from Connecticut.
I withdraw my request for a quorum, and I yield to the senator from California.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to considering the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Central Intelligence Agency, David H. Petraeus of New Hampshire to be Director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 hours for debate, equally divided and controlled in the usual form. The senior senator from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I come to the floor as the chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence to speak about the nomination of General David Petraeus to become the director of the CIA. I want to thank the Majority Leader for bringing this nomination to the floor in such a quick fashion because the committee earlier this week, Tuesday, unanimously approved the nomination of General Petraeus. I think that there is no doubt but that General Petraeus is among the finest military officers and strategic thinkers of his generation. We are very lucky to have his service. He wrote the Army's counterinsurgency strategy and then applied it in Iraq, securing a military victory from what had appeared to be a descent into chaos and violence. 1 year ago to this day, the Senate confirmed General Petraeus to replace General Stanley McChrystal as the leader of American and international security assistance forces in Afghanistan. Since then, he has shifted the strategy, implemented the troop surge, kept our coalition together, and today, military and intelligence analysts point to gains in the security situation and in the Afghan military and police's ability to secure their nation. General Petraeus's willingness to take on the Afghanistan mission also demonstrates his extraordinary commitment to public service. At the time, he was serving in Tampa, Florida, as a combatant commander for Central Command, no longer directly in charge of a war zone, but with the responsibility for not just Afghanistan, but for 19 other countries as well. He agreed to what was a step down in the military, quote, org chart, end quote, to take on the hardest military challenge in the world and to deploy from Tampa to Kabul. The nation certainly owes General Petraeus a debt of gratitude for 37 years in uniform. But when he is confirmed, General Petraeus will be taking off the uniform to become Director Petraeus. He has clearly considered the differences in culture and mission between the CIA and the military, and now he'll shift his style to lead intelligence collectors and analysts rather than officers and enlisted troops. As a matter of fact, in our hearing in Hart 216, there was a bit of levity when he was asked the question about how he would transition from a four-star major American general to a civilian role as director of the CIA. And he said, "You can be sure that when I arrive at the CIA, I will arrive without an escort and just simply get out of my automobile and walk into the building." Well, as we looked out in the audience and we saw a phalanx of officers accompanying the general, it became very clear that it was indeed quite a transition. I believe, and I think this is the importance of this nominee, that General Petraeus understands the difference and is prepared to move into a civilian organization at a difficult time. Now, Mr. President, of our 16 different intelligence agencies, one is generally and hopefully, although there have been 7 military commanders in our history who have become head of the CIA, but generally directed by a civilian. And of course, Leon Panetta is in fact a civilian. I think we have to consider the timing of this. The wind down of 2 wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, the operation in Libya, a restive Middle East where the changes in an Arab Spring are not yet felt, an Israeli-Palestinian situation that has to it crisis dimensions, the North Korean situation with respect to the nuclear weaponry of that country, Iran, a very dangerous country with the potential of becoming a nuclear country, and above all things, the fact that in September is the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and where there is nonspecific intelligence that this country may well have a revenge attack. Therefore, I think the military service will come in handy. I think his analytical skills and ability will come in very handy, and I really believe he's the right man for the job at this time. Through the confirmation process, the Intelligence Committee has sought to understand General Petraeus's vision for the CIA and how he will lead it through the challenges that I've just mentioned. I believe he's answered these questions and laid out his views. He has testified that he had discussed this possible move to the CIA with Secretary Gates as far back as last year. He even demonstrated that he knows the CIA culture and the lingo, saying that right after being sworn in, he'll call an all-hands meeting for all CIA employees and, quote, "will tell them right up front that you all should know that I'm here to recruit you and I know you're here to recruit me," end quote. He has met with just about every CIA former director and received their advice on running the agency, and he plans to put that advice into practice. General Petraeus has written and testified that he fully appreciates that the mission of the CIA is to provide unvarnished intelligence assessments to policymakers, whether they like it or not. And that is a fundamental point. The intelligence must stand on its own. It must be good intelligence, it must be streamlined intelligence, and it must be intelligence which has been subject to the best of analysis and red teaming. This was one of the questions that had been raised during his confirmation. Would General Petraeus put aside his military commander's assessments and carry forth the agent's analytic view? He answered the question head-on, pointing out that he has experience in the analytic field and in debating assessments to reach the best judgment possible. General Petraeus specifically pointed to his academic background as well as his military commands. He, in fact, has earned, and I don't think many people know this, a Master's of Public Administration and a Ph.D. in International Relations from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He has served an assistant professor of international relations at the United States Military Academy at West Point, from which he has graduated, and as a fellow at Georgetown University. So, the culture and debate in the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence will not be new to General Petraeus, and he understands the importance of presenting clear analytic views and analyses. While all members are familiar with General Petraeus's recent positions, let me touch on some of his prior experience. Prior to command in Iraq, he served at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, during which time he oversaw the development of the Army and Marine Corps' counterinsurgency manual. The importance of that manual is that it has stood the test of time since then. Earlier in his career, he served in Bosnia, where he was the Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations of the NATO Stabilization Force and the Deputy Commander of the United States Counterterrorism Task Force Bosnia. Prior to his tour in Bosnia, he spent 2 years at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, serving as the Assistant Division Commander for Operations of the 82nd Airborne Division, and then as Chief of Staff of the Airborne Corps. In addition, he has served in a number of staff assignments: aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army, military assistant to the Supreme Allied Command Europe, Chief of Operations of the United Nations Force in Haiti, and executive assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Not only is this a man who has been around, this is a man who has commanded, who understands the military, and who has produced for the United States of America. From my meeting and discussions with him, his responses before, during, and after our confirmation hearing, and based on his remarkable background, I am absolutely confident that General Petraeus will make an excellent director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I hope his confirmation vote will be unanimous. That makes it a real mandate. Mr. President, while we are here to consider the nomination of David Petraeus, I would also like to note and recognize some other people. First and foremost, Defense Secretary Bob Gates, a former Director of Central Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense whose term ends today. Secretary Gates has been a tremendously dedicated public service throughout his career, but never more needed and appreciated than his last 4.5 years as Secretary of Defense. He has presided over the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has managed the largest organization in the world at the Pentagon. He has earned the complete trust and respect of both President Bush and President Obama, and of every single member of this body. That almost makes him an endangered species. He is the model of the professional government official, and his leadership and his character is truly an example to us all. I wish him well as he goes back to the state of Washington, and candidly, on a personal level, I will never forget his service to our country. Next, today, is Leon Panetta's last day as Director of the CIA. I was very proud to be able to introduce Director Panetta as a native Californian at his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of Defense earlier this month. And I really can't say enough about the job he has done and my appreciation for the relationship we have had over the past 2 years. I think it's well known that when this first cropped up that he might be considered for CIA director, I really thought that the service could be best served by someone with CIA experience. I can say here, I couldn't have been more wrong. Director Panetta has stepped in when the Senate has had a hard time finding agreement and really put together a note of confidence in this body that is unsurpassed. And I believe that's true at the agency as well. He has raised morale, he understands the priorities, he has set the priorities, and he was eminently prepared to be the commanding officer in the takedown of Osama bin Laden. This indeed makes his service both unique and very special. I hope and expect that the vote on General Petraeus will be overwhelming. It speaks of the President's choices of such qualified and respected nominees and of their willingness to continue service. Quickly, I'd also like to recognize the person who will be, as of tomorrow, the acting director of the CIA, Michael Morell. Now, I notice that the Vice Chairman, the distinguished Saxby Chambliss, is on the floor, Vice Chairman of our committee, and I believe that both of us feel that Mike Morell has given our Intelligence Committee nothing but the unvarnished truth. He has come in, he's been prepared to answer questions, he has brought facts, he is an articulate, a strong briefer. He knows the agency, and I believe he's going to lead the agency until the beginning of September, when General Petraeus completes his tour in Kabul in July, and then there will be a transition period as he returns home and resigns his commission. In the interim, Mike Morell will be in charge. I think we both believe that the agency will be well served by his service as acting director. Finally, I want to thank Mrs. Holly Petraeus, the wife of David Petraeus, and the Assistant Director of Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, responsible for the Office of Service Member Affairs. General Petraeus mentioned at his hearing that Holly had been with him for 37 years and 23 moves, and we thank her for continuing to share her husband with our country. Madam President, you and I both know how difficult it is when we have a spouse somewhere else, let alone having a spouse somewhere in great jeopardy in wartime America, in countries at which we are waging war year after year after year. She indeed is a very special woman, and I think the General is very lucky to have her as his spouse. In the position of Director of the CIA, he will carry out one of the most important posts in our government. The Director is a senior member of the President's National Security Team and provides candid and objective analysis on every single national security issue that this nation faces. But the Director is also in charge of clandestine and covert operations around the globe. It's one of the reasons why our oversight responsibility is so important in these areas, to see that the law's followed and to see that missions are carried out with the full oversight of our committee. He is responsible for the security of the people of his agency and for making sure that their efforts are in keeping, as I said, with the nation's laws and ethics. It's a unique and difficult combination of management, of intellect, and most importantly, of character, because things can go awry, and one can elect not to follow the law. And I believe that that will not be the case with General Petraeus, and I believe he will follow the law, and he will do an excellent job. So I fully, 100%, absolutely support his confirmation, and I'm very pleased to yield the floor to the distinguished Vice Chairman of the committee, the Senator from Georgia.
Madam President.
The Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, first of all, let me thank and commend the Chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence for her great work, not on this issue, but on every other issue that we have had the opportunity to work on together over the past 6 months. She has been, number one, has reached out to me and my staff every day to make sure that we're doing the intelligence work in the way that we both agree it ought to be done, and she's done a magnificent job of leading the committee. The nomination of David Petraeus is a classic example of how she has led our committee, and that is that we need a very smooth transition, a very quick transition when it comes to the leadership of the intelligence community. And what Chairman Feinstein did was, as soon as the announcement was made on Director Panetta's removal to the nominee for Secretary of Defense and that David Petraeus was going to be the nominee for CIA Director, she made sure all of the background was done immediately so that we could go ahead and schedule a hearing well in advance of the movement by Director Panetta to the Office of Secretary of Defense and preparing for the confirmation of General Petraeus to be the next director of the CIA. That's not always easy, but she made sure it got done, and I want to commend, too, the Majority Staff Director, David Granis, as well as the Minority Staff Director, Martha Scott Poindexter, for their work in doing the background that was needed to be done to allow this nomination to move very quickly. And it's a pleasure to work with Chairman Feinstein. She certainly has the best interest of America and Americans at heart from an intelligence standpoint, and she's doing a terrific job, and it's a pleasure to work with her.
Thank you.
I rise also to speak in favor of the nomination of General David Petraeus to be the next director of the Central Intelligence Agency. General Petraeus has had an exemplary military career, and I look forward to his confirmation as the agency's 22nd director. Before I talk about him, I, too, would like to acknowledge his wife, Holly, for her service and support. In addition to supporting a military family during a number of long and unprecedented deployments and 25 moves, Holly Petraeus has also worked to protect military families from predatory lending practices. I appreciate her long-standing commitment and support of our men and women in uniform and want to thank her for joining her husband in answering our nation's call of duty. The strain on a military family just can't be overstated, and Holly Petraeus is certainly an individual who exemplifies everything that's good about how a military family needs to support the military member, and I truly commend her for her great service to our country in that respect. The nomination of David Petraeus comes at a pivotal moment in our history as we face threats from across the globe. As a warfighter, he brings a unique perspective, having seen firsthand the tactical value of accurate and timely intelligence. This experience, in an era of unparalleled cooperation between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense, will not only benefit the military and the intelligence community, but also the American people. General Petraeus graduated from West Point in 1974, but he has spent the better part of the last decade on the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. No matter what the task, David Petraeus has always answered this country's call. Most recently, after turning around the war in Iraq and putting us on a path to success, he left his position as commander of U.S. Central Command, where he was again called upon for an unexpected deployment to Afghanistan. General Petraeus understood the importance of the mission and accepted the assignment with vigor. And after leading the surge in Afghanistan, many expected him to retire from the military and public service, but not David Petraeus. He has decided to accept one of the most challenging positions in the U.S. government. As the director of the CIA, General Petraeus will face a number of critical challenges, many of which can't be anticipated. However, without a doubt, the threat from terrorism will remain the focal point for the CIA and for the new director. The successful strike on bin Laden removed al-Qaeda's leader, but not the threat from terrorism. The al-Qaeda core has been weakened, but their extremism and violence continues to spread through affiliates like AQAP in Yemen and other like-minded radicals. General Petraeus understands these threats, and I look forward to working with him to make sure the nation remains vigilant through these very uncertain times. I recall very vividly my first encounter with David Petraeus. It was in Iraq when he was in charge of the training of the Iraqi security police and the military personnel. And I remember standing on a rooftop outside of Baghdad and observing an operation, a training mission that was going on where Iraqi security police and military personnel were interacting and carrying out this training mission with U.S. military personnel. And just being around David Petraeus that first day, you could sense that there was something special and something different about this great leader. The respect that he commanded from all of his subordinates and the respect that he showed to his superior officers was evident, and it was pretty obvious that there was something very unique about David Petraeus. Obviously, he has gone on to provide the right kind of leadership that America has grown to expect from our great military leaders, and certainly David Petraeus has exemplified the very best that the United States military has to offer. It's also important that we note, as Chairman Feinstein stated, that there are some other folks who are moving to different positions or leaving public service that have been so valuable to the intelligence community. I've had the privilege of working with Secretary Bob Gates as a member of the Armed Services Committee on a fairly regular basis, and Secretary Gates would be the first one to tell you he and I hadn't always agreed on everything, and that's part of what makes this institution work so well and what makes our country such a great country. But what a professional individual he is, and he has provided the exact kind of service as Secretary of Defense that has been needed during his years at the Pentagon, which have not been easy years. These have been very difficult years to move through the Iraq situation, surge into Afghanistan, as well as to deal with all the other myriad of issues from personnel to health care to weapon systems that the Secretary of Defense has to deal with on a daily basis. I just admire and respect Bob Gates so much, and obviously we certainly wish him best in the private sector. Leon Panetta moving from the CIA to the Office of Secretary of Defense is a natural, and as I have stated on this floor previously, I miss him, will miss him as a director, because I think he's done such an exemplary job. He came in without a lot of the experience from an intel standpoint that some folks thought that the director should have. But having worked with Leon Panetta when he was Chief of Staff to President Clinton, having worked with him as Director of OMB under President Clinton, I knew what kind of man he is. And I knew that Leon would adapt very quickly, and that is exactly what has happened. He rolled his sleeves up and went to work. He has traveled around the world meeting not only with leaders of other nations, but he always makes sure that he goes down and visits not just the station chief in the countries where he's visiting, but the personnel that really are out there putting their life on the line every day to try to protect America and Americans. And he has certainly gained the respect of every individual at the CIA as well as members of this body. And not only has he gained respect, but the morale at the CIA today is probably the highest it's been since I have ever been involved over the last decade with the CIA. I think he's done just a magnificent job, and he's going to do likewise as the Secretary of Defense. The Chairman is right. Mike Morrell stepping in for the next couple of months will allow us to have a very seamless transition during the interim, because Mike is such a gifted professional, and he appears before the committee on a regular basis, and he does provide the direct, unfiltered, raw kind of information that we need to hear. And he is a great individual. He's been a great leader as the #2 person at CIA, where he will continue to serve. And during the interim, he's going to continue that kind of leadership that we, again, have grown to expect from the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So I'm very pleased that Mike Morrell is in the position that he is at this point in time, so that we'll continue to have the right kind of leadership at the agency. With that, Madam President, let me just say that we had a unanimous vote out of the committee on the nomination, the confirmation of David Petraeus, and I, like the chairman, hope that we have a very outstanding unanimous vote today for General Petraeus to be confirmed as the next director of the CIA. And with that, I would yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from California.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank the Vice Chairman for his remarks. And I'd like to thank him also for his willingness to work as a bipartisan team, which, as he said, we have done. And I think the dividends have been great for our committee in that we've been able to get an authorization bill passed, we've been able to effect some changes, we have been able to work together, our staffs work together, and in particular I'd like to thank David Granis and I'd like to thank Martha Scott for her work in this regard. I think it's extraordinarily important that Americans know that there is in the Senate of the United States a team of oversight that is in fact working together on a true bipartisan basis. So, Mr. Vice Chairman, thank you so much for that and it's been wonderful for me and particularly for your friendship as well. So thank you. And I yield the floor, and I note the Republican whip on the floor.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam President. First, let me acknowledge two of the great leaders of the Senate have just made very ringing endorsements of General Petraeus to head the CIA, which we will be voting on in about an hour and a half. And I associate myself fully with their remarks because they are in such a good position to know, as Chairman and Ranking Member, respectively, of the Intelligence Committee. I think my colleagues will defer to their judgment about this, but more than that, most of us have gotten to know General Petraeus because he has been so involved in so many of the important policy decisions of this country that we've all been able to form our own judgments and reach the same conclusions that the chairwoman and ranking member of the committee have articulated so well just now. I am glad to associate myself with their remarks. Madam President, noting that no one else is on the floor to speak further about this nomination, I would ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. We are going to be foregoing a July 4th break to go back home to visit with our constituents in order to stay here ostensibly to work on the problem of the accumulating budget deficit and huge debt that the United States has taken on, and the need to do something about that in conjunction with the President's request that we raise the national debt ceiling. What I'd like to briefly address today is what seems to me to be an obsession on the part of the President to raise taxes. In fact, he is so fixed on this, it is so important to him to raise taxes that he's willing to risk an economic crisis knowing that Congress won't raise taxes as part of this debt ceiling increase. And we shouldn't. Not because we're trying to protect somebody, but because higher taxes on an already weak economy would just make things worse. Now, we can point to a lot of things the President has done since he took office that have made things worse. But I don't know of a single economist who believes that American businesses will be more likely to hire people, will be more likely to create jobs if they're faced with paying higher taxes. They won't. Everyone knows that. So when the President talks about raising taxes, he's talking about killing jobs. And I'd like to speak about the three specific taxes that he has talked about. I know because I was the Senate Republican delegate in the meetings with the Vice President at which this was discussed. Now, I'm not going to break the commitment that we all made to each other to discuss things that the President has not already made public. So I won't discuss the many things the Democrats took off the table. They talk about Republicans taking things off the table. I think they've already made it clear that, for example, they took any changes in Obamacare off the table. I won't get into that. And I won't discuss other things that were a part of our conversations. But since the administration spokesman and the President specifically yesterday has identified three of the things that they did put on the table and wanted to discuss with us. I feel that I might as well explain to you why we're not willing to raise these kinds of taxes, because they're all job-killing taxes. They would all inhibit growth, which is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. Now, what are these job-killing tax increases on small businesses and American families and other businesses? It's not, first of all, just on millionaires and billionaires and corporate jets. President Obama and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are obviously using poll-tested rhetoric here about only raising taxes on millionaires and billionaires and corporate jets, because that sounds good. And they want ordinary Americans to believe that they will not be affected by the President's tax increase proposals. But the truth is that the provisions they put forward during the debt limit meetings with Vice President Biden would target small businesses and other job creators, and many Americans who are far from being millionaires or billionaires. And I should mention right off the top here that they never discussed with us in these meetings anything having to do with corporate jets. So I haven't gone to look to see how many American workers are employed in the general aviation business. I noted that it was on a list that they gave to us, but they never checked. I suspect that that is more in the realm of political rhetoric, since it doesn't, even under their proposal, I have seen raise very much money. But in any event, what have they actually discussed with us? Well, the first thing they discussed was repealing something called LIFO. Now, LIFO is a term, last in, first out, that is used by accountants as one of the method of inventory accounting. And for years, there's been a question, and more than a third of American businesses use this particular method of accounting. It's perfectly appropriate, legal, and so on. But there's been some talk, well, should we have everybody use the same standardized method of accounting? And there have been proposals to do that in the past. The problem is that what the Obama administration wants to do is not just to conform everyone to the same type of accounting here, but to actually go back and retroactively tax the businesses who have been using this accounting practice, which is perfectly legal, totally recognized by the Internal Revenue Service, nothing wrong with it, but they're going to go back and say, because we are interested in raising revenue, we're going to put a retroactive tax on all of you who have been using this method of accounting. More interested in getting money than in tax fairness. And that's why we are opposed to this. It would represent a retroactive tax increase on the 36% of American businesses that use this perfectly legal method of accounting. Now, who uses it? Mostly it's people in the retail business and manufacturers. There are other many who are small businesses, I might add. And to show you what the impact of this would be. By the way, we first talk about creating jobs in the retail sector where consumers come in and buy things, and in the manufacturing sector where they are made. These are the very folks who use this method of accounting. And here's the effect that it would have on small businesses. In September 2009, the Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy, this is under the Obama administration, wrote to the Tax Reform Subcommittee of the President's own Economic Recovery Advisory Board that repealing LIFO, and I'm quoting here, would result in a tax increase for small businesses that could ultimately force many small businesses to close. Why on earth would we impose a tax retroactively on folks who probably, at least according to the President's own Small Business Administration, would ultimately have to close their business as a result of the imposition of this tax? Why would we do that? Shouldn't that at least be taken into account before you propose something like this? Or are you so obsessed with finding somebody to raise taxes on or getting revenue that it doesn't matter? With unemployment at 9.1%, we should not raise taxes on America's job creators. Here's the second one that they discussed, capping itemized deductions. They proposed capping itemized deductions for upper-income taxpayers, either at the 28% or 35% level. And obviously, this reduces the ability of taxpayers to buy homes, to make gifts to charity, to pay medical expenses, all of the things for which deductions are taken. And as the Wall Street Journal editorialized on June 29th, and I'm quoting, "The political point of this exercise is to raise marginal tax rates without appearing to do so," end of quote, which is exactly what would happen. That editorial points out that President George H.W. Bush agreed to a similar proposal as part of his 1990 budget agreement that broke his read-my-lips promise not to raise taxes. But the fact is that half of all small business income falls in the top two brackets, so that the ability of small businesses to grow and create jobs would obviously be harmed by this proposal. The fact is that most high-income taxpayers, individual taxpayers, already lose the benefit of tax deductions and credits at their income level because of what's called the alternative minimum tax. And we each year eliminate the effect of the alternative minimum tax, except on those making, I believe it's above $250,000. So the very people who would be capped here are already capped under the AMT. Who would get hurt? Well, we know that 50% of the taxes paid by small businesses are paid in these two upper brackets because they pay individually, and it is those folks that can't that would get hit by this because they have to take the deductions as part of their businesses. They would end up having their deductions capped and being unable, therefore, to invest that in hiring more people. Moreover, the tax increase would hit a much larger segment of American families than just millionaires and billionaires. According to the Internal Revenue Service, in 2008, the last year that we have numbers for, only 319,000 tax returns showed income of $1 million or more. But in that same year, the number of returns falling in the 33 and 35% brackets, which are the brackets most affected by this proposal, numbered more than 3.6 million. In other words, more than 10 times the number of filers who would be hit if only millionaires and billionaires were affected. So while the President likes to claim that he only wants to tax millionaires and billionaires, the fact is that his proposal would hit small businesses and millions of Americans who are not millionaires. But as I said, most importantly, it affects job creation because the people that would be hit by this are the people who pay or small business entrepreneurs who pay their taxes under these provisions and would no longer be able to deduct their business job expenses. Why? With economic growth at just 1.9% in the last quarter, would Congress want to raise taxes on small businesses and on American families? It just doesn't make sense. And finally, oil and gas. Always popular to talk about attacking big oil. Of course, millions of Americans and retired Americans own stock in oil companies, and raising taxes would have the effect of both reducing what they get in their pensions and so on, as well as undoubtedly resulting in higher gasoline prices because most of these kinds of taxes are passed right on through to the consumer. So they want to raise taxes on U.S.-based oil and gas companies. Not foreign-owned companies, U.S.-based oil and gas companies. Obviously, this tax could result in higher gas prices, which contradicts the reason for releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Why do that if it's going to get canceled out by imposing a new tax? It could obviously hurt job creation because this industry supports over 9.2 million American jobs. And it doesn't just target oil companies because they get some kind of special benefit. What these provisions do is eliminate a tax provision applicable to all businesses. Any manufacturing business, for example, has the benefit of these particular three tax provisions. So why single out one particular group of taxpayers, only about 5 in number, who would no longer be able to take advantage of provisions that every other American business can take advantage of? They are broadly available to American businesses in one form or another, and they are three specific things. First, the so-called Section 199 deduction available to all manufacturers. Second, U.S. businesses are generally able to prevent double taxation when they have to pay taxes abroad. Those taxes are then credited against their American tax burden. And third, most businesses can expense their research and development costs. These are the three things that would be taken away just from oil companies, the folks who find American oil so that we can drive our cars and conduct our businesses. So raising the cost of producing American oil would help our foreign competitors, make us more dependent on them, drive high-paying jobs offshore, increase our dependence on foreign oil, cause gas prices to rise, and hurt American families already struggling with high food and energy costs. Why would we want to do this except to demagogue a political issue because it sounds good to punish success? America has never been about punishing success. America has been all about creating opportunities. And this President's ideas of raising taxes as the sine qua non of an agreement to achieve an increase in the debt ceiling, as he's proposed, would be absolutely contrary to what we're all trying to do right now, which is to help our economy get healthy so that it can create more jobs, so we can reduce this tremendously high unemployment rate that we have right now, put Americans back to work, help our families, and ironically, by getting healthier economically, making more money, producing more revenue for the federal government to tax under our existing taxes. So if we want economic growth, if we want improvement in the economy, the last thing we should be doing when our economy is ailing now is imposing a higher tax burden on it. Why the President is so obsessed with this, I do not know. But I will tell you one thing. Republicans will resist these job-killing tax increases, not because we are trying to protect somebody except the American people, but because we know that it's bad for our economy, for our families, for our businesses, and for job creation.
Madam President?
The senator from Massachusetts.